Good morning and a very warm welcome to the second panel of the conference Inclusive Education Across Borders. In this panel, we would like to discuss intersectionality as a lens to education inequalities during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Khaled. I'm a Mercator IPC Fellow at Istanbul Policy Center of Sabancı University and postdoctoral research at the Department for Intercultural and Comparative Education at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. And it's my pleasure to share this panel today together with the support from Joanna Szyminska, who's also a former Mercator IPC Fellow at Istanbul Policy Center. And Joanna will collect your questions and join us later during the discussion. Yeah, the focus of this panel is on the concept of intersectionality, a concept that aims to address gaps in legal and institutional frameworks to acknowledge the interplay of different forms of discrimination and belonging. And in the last 2 decades or so, the concept of intersectionality has been translated into different contexts via various reception channels and is more and more referred to in the debate on social inequalities. And in this debate, it's sometimes assumed that everyone immediately understands what this term means. Also, there are quite different, sometimes even contradictory ways of defining and using this concept. So in this panel, we would like to figure out what is intersectionality and how it might help us to identify, to analyze and to address multiple forms of discrimination that children, especially children seeking protection in Turkey and the European Union face. And here we would like to also take a critical look at one-dimensional notions of the term refugee children. And we would like to also address this and discuss approaches that can help us to better address intersectional forms of discrimination in education and how those approaches can be fed into politics, law, and educational institutions. We are delighted to discuss these questions with 6 distinguished experts. 2 of them are still missing, but we are optimistic that they will join us later. So we are happy to have here Nivedita Prasad, Kemal Buraytalan, Aisha Uzun, Tuba Yilmaz, and Kura Yilmaz Günay. They will probably come later, join us later, and Anna Karastatis. So, and as well Oliver Kontny, who will be the interpreter of some of the talks of this panel. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much to all of you for joining this panel. We will introduce you to the audience in a second, but first, Joanna will give you a short overview of the structure of this panel. Joanna, please.
Yes, thank you, Ellen. Yeah, here we go. So all panelists will give a 15 to 20 minutes presentation based on their different research and work experiences. And this is followed by a discussion with you, our audience. And here we would like to ask you to share your thoughts and questions via the chat box, which you can see on your screen. And you can already start to send your questions during the first presentation and continue afterwards during the next ones. And after the discussion, we are happy that Anna will summarize the lectures and discussion and comment everything together from her perspective. Ellen, I'm giving you the word again.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. So let's start. We would like to give the floor to Nivedita Prasad first. Nivedita is a professor at Ali Salomon University for Applied Sciences in Berlin, and she has worked on issues of intersectionality from an academic and an activist perspective. And in addition, she's active in the field of social work with refugees, and is also the director of the master study program Social Work as a Human Rights Profession at Ali Salomon University. And in March 2012, Nivedita was awarded the Anne Klein Award for her ongoing dedication to the human rights of migrant women. Yeah, Nivedita, we are happy to have you and that you will introduce us to the concept of intersectionality and its implications for analyzing and addressing the situation of asylum-seeking children. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just saw in the chat there's a comment in German from Tuba that she's there. So but Cora is in. So
okay, Tuba, welcome. We are very happy to have you with us. Good to see you. Good to know that you're here now. Thank you. Thanks, Nivedita, for the send.
Okay, I'll just start this presentation. Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really very interested in the conversation we're going to have later. So what I'll do is I'll start a little bit by explaining what intersectionality is, where it comes from, and try to apply it on the situation of children seeking protection in times of sort of during COVID-19, which is quite a few issues. So let's see how far we get. First of all, I need to say that I'll be using a few pictures, and this first one is called Bureaucracy. All these pictures are from a participatory action research project called Wallah, My Life. This is a name the youngsters gave to this project. The youngsters, obviously, I cannot give their full names, but are Ahmed, Alaa, Amin, Issa, and Khaled, who did this project with Annabelle Specht. And I find the pictures very interesting because they give an insight about how they see their lives or their situations, because all of them were unaccompanied minors in Berlin in 2017. So most of the pictures I'm using are from this exhibition, and obviously I have the permission to use these pictures. So I'll start with one picture that Issa took. He called it Holiday. And why am I showing you this picture? Because I think from an intersectional perspective, it's nice and very interesting to see how Issa could be introduced. Obviously, Issa is a boy. He's under 18. He's living as an unaccompanied refugee in Berlin with state support. And for Issa, it would be very important to say that he's very cool, he's very funny, and he's very experienced in tailoring. So these are just a few adjectives to sort of describe him, and you can see some of them are underlined and some are not underlined, and I'll explain later why. And the interesting part in intersectionality is that obviously he is all of this at the same time. So he's not a boy today and a refugee tomorrow. He's not under 18 today and cool tomorrow, but he's all of it at the same time. And that is sort of the interesting part in sort of in intersectionality, because what intersectionality does is that it acknowledges various factors of belonging and discrimination simultaneously. And now you can see that I've sort of underlined discrimination because some of these aspects are relevant for being discriminated and others are just, parts of his life. So basically intersectionality looks into various factors of discrimination, but also belonging. And the belonging is important because if you only look into discrimination, we could have this understanding that white, heterosexual, able-bodied men have nothing to do with intersectionality. Obviously they do. So basically it's a sort of a focus and a lens on belonging and discrimination, which is why not all categories of belonging are relevant. Sorry, just a second. Because intersectionality focuses on what we call intersections of systems of domination. So race, class, gender, and so on. I'll come to it later. And intersectionality looks into how these categories interact or interweave with each other. And intersectionality analyzes exclusions and inclusions at various levels. So if you just look into the fact that we talk about refugees, all refugees internationally have always experienced personal exclusion or discrimination, historical discrimination and exclusion, but also on the structural and the institutional level. So it's not any form of belonging, but those sort of categories that are important for a sort of anti-discriminatory analysis. So the background of intersectionality has sort of, I would say, at least two different branches. One comes from activism. That's where the belonging part may be important. And the concept of intersectionality is grounded in decades of activism that battled the challenges of racism, sexism throughout the 20th century. This is a quote from the Center of Intersectional Justice in Berlin, that's CIJ. And the reason why sort of intersectionality had to come into activist movement was that social movements till today often argue, that they represent all members of their group, but often they ignore marginalized realities within their groups. So for example, the activist roots are quite often said to be laid in the US Black women's movement, but actually in all movements that have considered intersectional realities. So for example, in Germany, it's the Black women's movement, the Jewish women's movement, the migrant women's movement, but also movements like Women in Exile, Youth Without Borders. And these two organizations are very interesting because we have a very strong refugee movement in Germany, But it's interesting that women decided to create their own social group, for example, Women in Exile, but also youngsters said, we don't feel represented by sort of the major movement of refugees, so we have our own organization called Youth Without Borders. So again, we have a social movement, like the refugee movement, who wants to represent all members, but often enough, it's only the dominant members within this group that are represented. So similar issues we have with disabled refugees, LGBTIQ refugees, and other refugees who are sort of in a marginalized position within the group of being refugees. From an academic point of view, and that's maybe where many of you have heard about the concept for the first time, has been introduced by Kimberlé Crenshaw, who's an activist and an academic. She studied law, and she analyzed court cases that are very interesting and actually ridiculous, because she found out that sort of one very well-known case is the case of de Graafenheid versus General Motors. In this case, what happened was that Black women were discriminated on at their working space, and when they went to court, the judges said, oh, you're not discriminated as Black people because the Black men are not being discriminated, and you're also not being discriminated as women because the white women are not being discriminated, which was true, but it was totally absurd because their specificity of being Black and woman was not considered. So this is one court case she analyzed. And the second court case she analyzed was Moore versus Huge Helicopter. This one is not as well known as the first one. Here, what she found out is that Black women were not allowed to stand up for women because they were only Black women. And if you look into other court cases, when white women go to court, they're just women, right? So again, she said, this is sort of interesting. We have white women who are considered to be able to represent all women, and we have Black women who are then only Black women. So she sort of answered the question to these multiple failures with her concept of intersectionality, which I will introduce in the next slide. This is Kimberlé Crenshaw here in Berlin. I would like to quote from a piece of work she wrote in 1989, and this is like 30 years old, and we celebrated its 30th birthday last year here in Berlin. She says, consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection, coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any numbers of direction and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a Black woman is harmed because she is in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination. This is possibly the definition you've heard of before, but what exactly does this sort of mean? So what Crenshaw says, and also what many social movements say, is that intersectionality concentrates on the intersection and entanglement of systems of domination that can lead to discrimination. They don't have to lead, but they can, and to social categories of belonging. So if you look into racism, obviously there's also this category of a belonging to a specific religion, having a specific nationality, and belonging to a specific racial background. If you look into classism is a system of domination. If you look into gender and sexual orientation, heteronormativity would be the system of domination. If you look into disability or ability, it would be ableism. And specifically for children, age and therefore adultism is a very important category that I think we should also talk about. So looking into the situation of, say, Issa, the guy I introduced to you on my second slide, it is very likely that Issa is not only seen as a boy, but he also experiences, he experiences being a boy from a very racialized, heterosexual point of view, which is sort of interesting. We don't know if he's heterosexual or not. I obviously did not ask him, but apparently there's this understanding that all refugee boys are sort of seen as heterosexual boys. So he experiences a gendered, racialized, classist version of adultism. And at the same time, if he experiences racism, it's always gendered, adultist, and classist. So what does this exactly mean? So if you look into mainstream society, usually being a heterosexual, young, able-bodied boy puts you in a very powerful position. But being seen as a heterosexual, young, able-bodied boy who is a refugee makes you very vulnerable to intersectional forms of discrimination. So it's just one aspect that has been changed. So basically we have young boys, able-bodied, who are seen as heterosexual, but only the fact that he's seen or is a refugee makes him very vulnerable to intersectional forms of discrimination. And obviously young boys react to this discrimination in various forms. And I find one piece of research that Olaf Struve has done very interesting. And he explains, for example, hypermasculine performances of racialized and socially excluded boys, like refugee boys, as a possibility to at least get a small piece of the cake that hegemonial masculinity offers. So I think this is a very interesting intersectional analysis on a situation that many of us maybe have experienced. This is another picture on adultism, I think is very interesting. This is Amin, this is his understanding of how he's being taken care of, right? So you see how small he is, how big the others are, and the others actually have weapons in their hand. And he's talking about social workers who are taking care of him. I think it's a very interesting picture we could talk about later. He's an unaccompanied young boy in Berlin. So for an intersectional analysis, I think it's really important to see that intersectional power relations can amplify each other, but don't necessarily have to do so. Like I said before, being a young boy normally puts you in a very dominant position, but not necessarily if you're a refugee young boy. So the intersectional identities or the intersectional discrimination is different. It's not additive or double, because the result is very different. And I would like to use the example of racial profiling. We know that racial profiling is something that one would say people of color experience, but it's not all people of color. It is young, usually men or boys of color, who are usually seen as heterosexual, who are able-bodied, and who are seen as disadvantaged by class. So the result we have is very different. So we cannot say that racial profiling is something that sort of affects all people of color. In theory, it can affect all people of color, but in practice, it affects the intersection of young, sort of age, gender, color, sexual orientation, disability, and class. So this is also something we can sort of talk about. And again, it's not a double discrimination, it's a total different form of discrimination, because you just need to change one of these aspects, and then the vulnerability to racial discrimination decreases immediately. So for example, if the young man of color who's seen as heterosexual has a visible disability, he is not so likely to be racially profiled as he would be with an able body. So it's sort of a very interesting interrelation of these different categories and the experience of discrimination. This is again one of the pictures from the project, which shows the intersection of race, gender, and age. This is Khaled at a police check, and when you sort of see the whole exhibition, you would find a sort of a description saying this is one of the realities they experience every day on their way to school, on their way to work, or on their way to just visit friends, because they live near this U-Bahn station, which is considered a dangerous area by the police in Berlin. So now looking into sort of COVID-19. So first of all, I'd like to start with challenges for all children seeking protection, because obviously these children and their parents need access to child-friendly information in a language they understand on COVID-19. And in Germany, and I guess in Turkey and Greece, the situation is very similar. These regulations are changing by week. So we need an ongoing sort of translation of child-friendly information, because these regulations are very sort of, very fluid. They need access to health, but also physical access to health. We have had cases in East Germany, especially, where a whole accommodation of refugees was put under quarantine, and the only bus going to this accommodation was stopped from being, just stopped, because the authorities sort of considered it to be too dangerous to sort of have this bus going there. So if this is the only way for people to move, how do they actually get to a doctor? How do they actually get into a supermarket and so on? So you need access to various things, but also access to healthcare. Something that is really sort of in my mind for a few months now is, how do you physically distance in a shared accommodation? This is basically impossible. Space is very limited, but also access to very important things like masks, disinfectants, etc. How do you quarantine in shelters? I mean, honestly, if there's a shelter with 400 people, the only way to quarantine is that you're actually stuck to your room. How do you get food? How do you get fresh air? How do you use sanitary facilities? How do children have space to play? And how is the access to the internet? These are all sort of very practical ideas, but honestly, I really don't understand how people survive the situation of quarantine in such a situation. And we have this hilarious idea of chain quarantines. We've had situations in Germany that if one person was tested positive, the whole accommodation was in quarantine. If the whole accommodation has 200 inhabitants, you can imagine that the next quarantine is very soon to come. So we've had cases of chain quarantines. So if authorities believe that one positive case in one accommodation leads to put a quarantine on the whole facility, the inhabitants are basically chained to quarantine for weeks. So not only for 14 days, but for much longer. Then this interesting idea of homeschooling. We know all these children are not at home, but they're in a place where they have to be schooled. The access to technical equipment and the internet is very important. Who can give input in German, Turkish, or Greek? And usually we know that missing school for children this time means losing a year at school. In Germany, we know, and I guess this is similar in Greece and in Turkey, that there have been more police controls, more checks, and we have evidence that these have also been racist police checks. So now I would sort of concentrate on the situation of children who are with their parents. So this first slide was for all children seeking protection. Now I would like to look into the situation for children with their parents. So here, being ill or being in quarantine means being with their parents in very limited space for 2 weeks. Honestly, this is a challenge for both sides, for the parents and for the children. But this is something we have to look into, I think. And we know from research now that the risk of domestic violence rises in times of quarantine, in times of very limited space. If you look into the specific situation of unaccompanied children in institutions, to be in quarantine or being ill means being alone. So we're talking of children who are quarantined or who are ill and are basically alone for 2 weeks, which is something highly problematic. On the other hand, it's also problematic to ask social workers to be in physical contact with children who have been tested positive. So I don't have a real solution to this problem, but this is sort of an issue. A big issue is the question of who has the right or even the obligation to monitor the quarantine. I know from social workers who work in institutions with young unaccompanied refugees who say the kids don't stick to the quarantine and the authority wants us to monitor this quarantine. Is it sort of the job of a social worker to monitor quarantine? I would argue no. So it would be maybe the legal guardian, but the legal guardian usually does not live with a child. So this is something I think we also need to look into. And social distancing in institutions actually means contact only to flatmates, but flatmates they're rarely chosen to live with. So again, they're in a situation that if they sort of meet others, these are others they had never sort of agreed to live with or they never chose. And we know that the children are very worried about their families who are either abroad or on their way, because we know that in this pandemic time, being on the way or being in camps on the way is something children are very worried about. I would like to end with 2 pictures from the same exhibition. And this again shows sort of, being what it means to be unaccompanied. But I think in times of quarantine, this picture is also very valid for the situation. Alaa called this picture loneliness. But I would like to end with a picture that reminds us that we talk about young people who also have dreams. This is the same guy who dreams of having a carpenter shop in Berlin. So far from my side, I'm glad to discuss these issues with you later.
Thank you very much, Nivedita, for this very comprehensive introduction to the concept of intersectionality, and also thank you for reflecting on this concept with regard to the situation of asylum-seeking children and challenges caused, or additional challenges caused by COVID-19. We would like to give the floor now to Kemal Vural-Tarlan, who's working as a researcher and a documentary photographer and general director of the Kaya Kültür in Gaziantep in Turkey. And here is the head of the Center for Migration and Cultural Studies for the Middle East. And since 2000, Kemal has been conducting visual sociology and anthropology research among Dome communities living in the Middle East. And he has penned many articles on the rights of refugees from the Middle East and worked as an activist. And besides, he's visiting lecturer at Communication Faculty of Gaziantep University. Kemal will give his presentation in Turkish, but there is a simultaneous translation in English by Oliver, and you can listen to this interpretation by selecting the English option in the translation, interpretation, in German it's Dolmetschen setting. And we also suggest you to mute the original audio. That means to mute Kemal. I mean, even though it might be nice to hear Kemal's voice, it might be necessary to mute him in order to be able to better understand Oliver's interpretation. So I hope everyone found the setting. Of course, you can also listen Kemal's talk in Turkish.
Honestly, I don't know how to mute other people. I know how to mute myself, but I wouldn't know how to mute Kemal.
I think it works when you mute yourself, right? Mürkan, can you just give us a short...
Sure. Could you please select to the click to the interpretation section and then select the English one? And after you select the English channel, then you can mute the original audio.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the function. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, that worked.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So Kemal, we are very much looking forward to your presentation on the other refugees, the educational situation of Dome children in Turkey and the EU.
Öncelikle davetiniz için çok teşekkür ederim. Sorry.
So I'm going to talk about the institutional dimensions of the Dome communities. We have been working with them for about 10 years now. And for more than 20 years, we've worked on defending the human rights of the Dome community and other peripatetic communities, especially of the children. So let me first introduce the Dome community to you. People know about the Roma communities, but the Dome communities are a bit different and there's not much information about them. And I think it's important to say that when the war started in Syria in 2011, Dome people came to Turkey from both Syria and some from Jordan. There's a big Dome community in Jordan, and of course also in Turkey there's a native Dome community. So we want to talk about how this situation influenced the access of Dome children to education in Turkey. And sorry, there's a technical error right now. So we prepared a report about the access to education in Dome children, and I'm going to rely on this report. So intersectionality comes in here because we are working on increasing visibility of discriminated communities. This is the access to intersectionality that we have. Basically, we think that we want to concentrate on obstacles that particularly Dome children face in the context of access to education when compared to other refugee children in Turkey, because they're a special group within the refugee communities, and we have conducted some field research in order to collect data. So there are three groups that are being called peripatetic, and the Dom is one of them. Historically, they migrated from India, from the Indian subcontinent, in about the 7th century, and first settled in Kurdistan and then spread throughout the Middle East as a community. So the Dom communities in the Middle East today usually speak Kurdish as a second language today, apart from the Dom language. And another peripatetic community is the Abdal community. They're especially concentrated in Turkey. And of course, they can be found throughout the regions that once belonged to the Ottoman Empire. So when we talk about peripatetic communities in Turkey, we specially refer to Dom and Abdal communities. So peripatetic is, I think, a more precise expression for craftspeople and nomadic people. And the Dom communities have been living this lifestyle and have exercised their own traditional crafts for hundreds of years. But unfortunately, those traditional professions, those traditional crafts have basically lost their relevance. So a lot of the formerly nomadic communities now are living in cities or small towns. And in Iraq, we saw in the past that there was a program to actually to settle the Dom communities, but they wouldn't actually stick to this lifestyle imposed by the government and reverted to their own lifestyles. Of course, the war is a different thing altogether. There would be about 150,000 Dom people in Turkey, still in Syria and in the neighboring countries, and some of them have come to Europe. Of course, there's a discourse that frames refugees as a more or less homogenic group. But if you look more closely, you will see, especially when we did fieldwork, that the refugees in Turkey are not a homogenic community at all. There are diverse and different communities among them, and some of the most disenfranchised are the Dom people. Because, as you know, in Europe, there is quite a strong anti-Ziganism, and this bias also exists in the Middle East. So, in all of the countries where we have Dom communities, they would either live in Roma communities or neighborhoods, or in their own small neighborhoods. And their situation in Turkey can be compared to the situation of Roma and also Dom and Abdal children throughout Europe, in that they are facing huge problems in access to education. And we have been working on this subject for decades now and trying to defend their right to an education wherever they are. Of course, we are working with other NGOs, and we are also trying to raise awareness throughout the public sphere in Turkey. So towards the end of 2019, before the pandemic started, we were able to conduct some research about the ground situation concerning the access to education in Dome children, and we found that most of them maintain problematic relations with school. Most of them just don't show up. And we had a look at the notion of education in Dome communities. So, of course, since we are working with refugee groups in Turkey, what we did was to concentrate on the Dome children who are living and have been living in Turkey, to see how they're doing in school, also how they're being treated, if they actually have access to education. But we also talk to their families about their educational situation. And we found that most refugee children in Turkey were already facing serious problems with regards to access to education before the pandemic. And one problem concerning that was that the governmental approach was to admit children to temporary educational facilities where they would actually be taught in Arabic. And also there were some private schools, for example, Libyan actors opened schools where actually the curriculum was brought in from Libya along with the money, and the children from Syria were taught in Arabic. And then it was decided by the Turkish government that all of the children living in Turkey should be included within the official Turkish educational system, school system. And then the pandemic began. So even before, only 60% of the refugee children living in Turkey were enrolled, had been enrolled in schools. So of course you can imagine that only very few of them were ever going to high school or even university. So when it comes to the Dome and Abdal children, they were facing huge problems. What we found was that we were actually surprised when we came across a single child that was regularly attending school. That was the exception. So about 5 months ago, no, sorry, I think it was in February 2020, when we were in a kind of tent village and we tried to enroll children in schools. Now, again, there's a technical problem in the transmission. And then the pandemic came and the children couldn't go to school any longer. So they were affected, especially by the pandemic. We collected data by conducting a variety of interviews, and I can say that this whole year basically was lost to the children in terms of education. We talked to a family where the mother said to us, we asked her if they had access to education, and the mother said, well, we do secure that the children are sitting in front of the screen, when they're supposed to, but actually because they don't understand Turkish, they get bored very quickly and they just start doing different things, and we can't even control that. So in places like Antakya and Antep, it was obvious that it was very, very problematic to even talk about access to education for the Dome children or for refugee children, and the government has been inactive on that. We're also talking about seasonal workers in farming, and of course we know that most of these laborers have children. There are like agricultural centers in Shukurova and Mersin, where especially the girl children of the laborers' families cannot actually go to school. They do not have access to education. So there's a region between Antakya and Antep, and we know that thousands of children are working in the cotton fields there instead of going to school. So as I said before, I think I have to say that there are about 50,000 Dome and Abdal families from Syria in Turkey, and they have about 20,000 children who need schooling. And we found that approximately 5% of them actually have access to schools, especially those living in the bigger cities like Istanbul and Izmir. And all the families beyond that actually don't have access to education. And that also is true for communities living in Lebanon and Jordan. In Brussels, we visited a community center 2 years ago where we saw that about 100 Dome families from Syria are living in Brussels, and they have their own community center in the city of Brussels, actually, in the city area. And these children, we found, were able to learn both English and French very quickly and were very good at adapting to the educational system they found. But unfortunately, the situation is very different in Turkey and in Syria's other neighboring countries. So one of the main problems before the pandemic, and we can discuss this later during the Q&A, was that most families cannot find employment because of discrimination. Discrimination is very high against Dome people, especially after the Gulf War, after the occupation of Iraq. There were two strategies adapted by the Dome communities in Iraq, and I think Syrian communities adapted similar strategies. Again, there's a technical problem. I cannot understand what is being said. But we know that in Turkey, there are camps for refugees where families were accommodated among Arabic, Turkmenic, and Kurdish families who said, we don't want to share the camp with the G-word families. So the Dome communities were discriminated against and excluded. So they are facing discrimination wherever they go. So some of them actually reverted to a nomadic lifestyle. And we come across migratory, nomadic Dome communities in Turkey, especially working in the fields and harvesting during harvest season, and trying to raise money in the streets. So they are being rendered invisible. And the bigger families are sometimes being split up, and some of them try to pass as Syrian Kurds because they speak Kurdish and try to actually be as invisible as they can. So basically, these communities would usually live in larger extended families, in communal structures, and suddenly they are confronted with a situation where they have to exist and subsist as core families in much smaller units without the networks of solidarity. So I think this is what I'd like to say right now. Maybe we can get questions later. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I was a bit quick, I think.
You can now switch the interpretation off again until Tuba's presentation and until we surely will come back to some of your observations, Kima, later in the discussion. For this discussion, we would also again like to encourage you, our audience, to already comment and ask your questions in the chat box so that Joanna can already collect your questions there. Yeah, but before we address your questions, we would like to give the floor to Ayşe Uzun. Ayşe is a lawyer and a leader of the LGBTQI protection team at Association for Solidarity with Asylum Seekers and Migrants, ASAM in Istanbul. And Ayşe has been working and studying the situation for refugees and forced migrants in Turkey for many years now. She has a master's in law and recently graduated from big universities, a cultural studies master program, and the title of her thesis was Impact of International and National Laws and Policies on LGBTI+ Syrian Migrants in Turkey. And yeah, Ayşe, we would like to give you the floor now for your presentation on intersecting forms of discrimination in education against LGBTQI refugee minors. Ayşe, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry, I cannot hear you. Can you hear me? Okay, but I cannot hear you, no. Okay, at least you can hear me, which is good. Okay, I'm gonna start. And thank you for inviting me and organizing such an important conference, Ellen and Yona. In my speech, I will try to mention how LGBTI+ refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, by the way, I will use all these status interchangeably, are affected due to intersectional discrimination in their daily life in Turkey. And in this regard, I will mention LGBTI+ migrant rights in Turkey shortly, and what is the situation of LGBTI+ minors in general, and how the development of pandemic exacerbates the state on LGBTI+ minors, and also education life of LGBTI+ minors, and suggestions regarding legal and political conditions. I have limited time. I will try to summarize all these issues, especially by referring to the practice and my field experiences. Turkey is often assumed to constitute and sorry, there is some problem, I think. My voice is not good. Okay, maybe I will try to... Sorry. Now, is it better?
It is better, yeah, much better. Thank you. Can you hear us again? Can you hear me again, Ayşe? No, apparently you cannot.
It's gonna change the also settings.
This is perfect now.
To be sure. Okay.
Can you hear
now
me?
It's better. And yeah, sorry for these problems. Okay, and yeah, However, according to reports of human rights organizations and our observations from the field, LGBT plus migrants in Turkey face several obstacles in enjoying fundamental rights and accessing basic service. And many reports show that LGBT plus migrants in Turkey are exposed to verbal, physical, and sexual violence due to the xenophobia and racism, in addition to the homophobia, transphobia, and that comes from state institutions, local people, and other refugee networks and their family members as well. And furthermore, LGBT plus migrants have been struggling to access service, social life, and their fundamental rights in their satellite states. And despite all these challenges, the only regulation based on sexual orientation and gender identity is Istanbul Convention in Turkey. And Istanbul Convention prohibits discrimination in through Article 3, yet discrimination of speech on sexual orientation and gender identity is made frequently even by state officials in Turkey. And however, policymakers do not accept that, and the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Turkey claimed that there's no need to regulate the discrimination based on SOGI, since it's already regulated in the constitutional law. And other authorities claim during the international meetings in Western countries, also regarding human rights. We can explicitly say that the lack of regulation regarding LGBT plus rights affect LGBT plus migrants' life negatively due to the exclusive regulation in migration policy and the legislative system as well. And the LGBT minors are one of the most precarious group among migrant population in Turkey. They are invisible in the society. As an example, while LGBT plus adults come to the office where I work for different reasons, and sometimes more than 20 applicants approach in same day, but LGBT minors approach so rarely. And it's also hard for NGOs to reach LGBT migrants as well, and the service providers become aware of the minors if only they reach out the organization, and most often they approach due to the sexual gender-based violence. So the communication between minors and organizations remains challenging due to the lack of any communication device. Minors often do not own their own phones. They cannot be provided any support to obtain a contact number, since they often lack any legal document such as family booklet or ID. And when they arrive to organizations, actually their legal documents are kept by their family members, which further leads to problems. And it's also hard to reach children who are under 12. Mostly their family approach NGOs by mentioning that their children is not normal. And in this case, our psychologists colleagues support both children and family. So their visibility depends on their family's approach, which is so actually problematic. And they're also invisible in the schools. Refugee children mostly go to public school where are overcrowded, and there is only one school advisor in each school. So school advisor cannot observe the struggles of LGBT plus refugee minors. And LGBT minors cannot go to the institutions such as police station to report SGBV incidents because of fear, lack of language, and lack of information. And many of them face SGBV in their families, and they hesitate to apply for protection mechanisms due to fears of further violence or their emotional and psychological attachment to their families. Moreover, they have no place to go when they escape their families, and they face accommodation problems. When adolescents approach to NGOs, such as NGOs where I work, mostly they want to be supported financially and settled in safe place as they are subject to violation in their family. And they do not want to make a complaint against of their family. As they are under 18, we have to refer them to the social service and in some case to the courthouse or police station. And in case of SGBV, the minors are referred by police or the courthouse to child institution after our application. Then, but the child institution are not designed to meet the specific demands of LGBTI plus minors migrants. And the LGBTI minors and young adults are exposed to multiple forms of violence within this institution. This institution, because are constructed based on gender binary norms, and there is also monolingual culture exists. And even after approach to the child court for protection orders, the judge cannot order efficient measures on behalf of LGBTI plus minors due to lack of all these capacities in the institutions. Moreover, the mainstream acceptance in the institution that children, young adults cannot be LGBTI+. And so some of officers do not take all these challenges seriously. Sometimes officers from the institution try to convince children to go back their house by saying that children's home and all other type of institution are worse than her or his house, and their family also can warn them as they are their families. They try to convince them actually to go back their home, and especially transgender and also transgender face challenges due to the lack of assignment of dorms in accordance with the gender identity. Hence, children who were settled in the institution, they do not stay in the assigned institution. I can say that almost all children who were settled in this institution just managed to stay only just maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I never faced more than this time they managed to stay. And but there are also good examples in the institution. Some of social workers or officers contact us for collaboration to create better environment, even under all this lack of facilities in the institutions. And under this system, LGBTI plus minors do not have financial or emotional support except NGOs. And the absence of system of care and support, as well as the lack of access to wider LGBTI networks, put their security and survival at risk. Many LGBTI plus refugee minors have difficulties to cope with homophobia, transphobia, language barriers, xenophobia in their daily lives. And LGBTI minors become more invisible also during the COVID, and the pandemic have exacerbated their precarious life in Turkey. Staying in homes further suggests isolation causes serious security threats to many LGBTI+, since family members could be the perpetrators of hate-motivated crimes. Some of LGBTI minors who don't have a home or who have to live with their family or who have to return to family homes have faced the domestic violence. And LGBTI plus minors have only one option, that is to be settled in the child institutions, as other measures were more ineffectiveness during the pandemic, such as foster family. Moreover, most of LGBTI plus minors couldn't reach online education system. And NGOs only distributed hygiene and food kits at the beginning of COVID. Due to the increasing of need lists, NGOs faced the budget issues, so couldn't support people financially as they supported before. And so the pandemic exacerbated the discrimination against of refugees, and the majority of aid organizations gave priority to citizens and refugees experiencing challenges in accessing aid. And in addition to inequalities in enjoying the right, domestic violence under isolation, the LGBT+ community have been targeted by a wave of hate-motivated campaigns by politicians. So intersectional discrimination become particularly visible when it comes to LGBT refugee minors, because being refugee, asylum seeker, LGBT+ minor make their life more precarious. And these refugees face specific forms of discrimination at the intersection of race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, gender, and age that interact with each other in an inseparable way. But the international and national asylum system only focuses on being an LGBTI is the reason for facing persecution in the country of origin. And current political conjuncture obviously do not consider multiple identities on their political agenda. Contrary, politicians give hate speech against of LGBT+ in Turkey. And what kind of discrimination do LGBT+ minors experiences due to the education program in Turkey? Actually, the education program is constructed based on patriarchal norms and nationalist elements in Turkey, which includes gender binary norms and lack of multilingual education system. And this caused the limited education opportunities for LGBT+ minor in education. And these social norms create homophobia and transphobia in schools as well. Under these circumstances, some of minors do not want to involve in education because of peer bullying and language barrier and racism, homophobia, transphobia. And also some of them do not want to go out of their land, but at the same time, they don't want to stay in the flat. Additionally, the coordination between relevant authorities from the government of Turkey and NGOs in creating the necessary conditions only focus on non-LGBTI minor refugees. However, during the COVID-19, accessing education has become more exclusive for minors, and NGOs have tried to support refugee children, but it was impossible to support every refugee children due to lack of capacity. Yet they, of course, play a significant role in supporting the education needs of vulnerable groups. So these structural barriers that includes the refugees' lack of consideration of multiple identities in curriculum make it impossible to pursue their education life. And in the meantime, the Istanbul Museum of Modern Art on March 28 called on school children who were forced out of classroom due to COVID-19 to draw rainbows and attach them to their windows in order to show the miracle of nature during the pandemic. But the local education leaders told school principals to forbid children from participating in the museum's project and say that drawing the rainbows was a ploy to turn children gay. And so the class, ethnicity, race, status, gender, and religious identity and age, socioeconomic conditions, and political conjuncture played a crucial role in the denial of basic education in Turkey for LGBT+ refugee minors. And these categories and identities and experiences of LGBT+ minors have to be considered for inclusive education system. So my suggestion is actually under all these political conjuncture, it's so hard to force the authorities and policymakers to change their political agenda, but service providers in state institutions, policy stations, civil society organizations, and minors also should be trained and about gender roles, legal rights, and responsibilities. And LGBTI focused agendas and policies somehow should be endorsed in the institution, such as the Ministry of Family, by this collaboration. And NGOs and parties can focus on the interface of migration, race, ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality, considering cooperation and solidarity. And NGOs should shouldn't focus only the protection of LGBTI plus minors, also focus on the empowering by organizing training panels and providing educational facilities. And the process also needs to be governed through the collaborative and dialogues between governmental agencies and local authorities such as Muhtar, Imam, NGOs, international institutions, and children themselves. And meeting with all minors and listen them and organizing activities based on gender roles with children, I think it's so crucial to find against all these heteronormative norms. And intersectionality should be applied to the ways in which the asylum law to consider multiple identities and factors on behalf of refugees. And through this communication and cooperation and solidarity with actors in education and subject, there will be important movement to fight right-wing hegemony and intersectional discrimination in education system. Thank you for listening and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for your comprehensive presentation, also your critical analysis on intersectional forms of discrimination that LGBTI+ refugee minors face in Turkey. Before we discuss, we would like to come to our final presentation now, and we would like to invite Tuba. Koray is unfortunately not here, cannot be here with us today. So we would like to invite Tuba to share her thoughts on the question, how can a better understanding of the complexity of identities be promoted in different educational settings? But before you start, I'd like to introduce you shortly. Tuba is the managing director of the Migration Council Berlin, which is an umbrella organization for Berlin-based migrant organizations of Black people and organizations of people of color. And Tuba is also the co-founder and the project manager of the Initiative for Intersectional Pedagogy. It's called IPED, which is also based in Berlin. And here, as well as in other educational contexts, Tuba offers, among others, edutainment lectures and workshops on intersectionality, power critical and racism critical education, LGBTQI discrimination, empowerment, conflict management, and organizational development. And Tuba will speak in German now. So again, for the English interpretation, we are happy to have Oliver again. So for listening to Tuba's talk in English, please select the English option again, and you might also mute Tuba while you're listening to Oliver, or if you, of course, would like to listen to Tuba in Germany, please feel free to do so. So Tuba, we are happy to have you. The floor is yours.
Oh, I love floors, yeah. Hi, I'm Tuba, sorry, Deutsch, sorry, okay. Merhabalar, ich bin Tuba.
I'm Tuba. Thank you for introducing me. I would now like to talk about one of our projects. So this is not an academic presentation. I think I was requested to really talk about our hands-on work and share some examples from day-to-day practice. I would like to describe our project and context.
Werden viele akademische Diskurse bedient.
I'm sure that a lot of academic discourses can actually be derived from it. So perhaps my volume, I think, was down. I hope I don't know, understandable. Thank you. So, Koray, unfortunately, is sick, but he sends his greetings to all of you. Here's my presentation. So we have this slogan, diversity what? Because people invite us to talk about diversity, and it's actually a concept that could be considered an evergreen or a top seller in Germany, diversity. So a lot of the times we're just left with saying diversity.
Offiziell gegründet.
In 2011, we established our project iPad. We got the first money from the Berlin Senate for Education, Youth and Family and started organizing workshops about intersectional pedagogy. And because we got the money from the Berlin Senate, we didn't charge the schools we were visiting. So what was interesting was that it started out as a queer project, and we especially organized workshops about LGBTIQ subject in schools, but we quickly found that we wouldn't be able to actually really work with these issues without also including the other aspects of what then became our intersectional approach in pedagogic work. And the project owner is the Migrationsrat, the Council of Migration of Berlin, which is an umbrella organization for about 80 organizations founded and run by people who were either immigrants or people of color or Black people. And we're mainly focusing on Berlin, even though Brandenburg is officially also affiliated, but there are many similar umbrella organizations in other member states of the Federal Republic of Germany. So the Council of Migration wasn't always the project owner. From the start, we started out with an NGO called Khaled, gays and lesbians mainly from Turkey, founded that one. And as an initiative, we thought it's better to actually reach out to different communities beyond the Turkish-speaking ones. And the Council of Migration actually took the decision in 2004 to act as an intersectional representative of POC communities and NGOs. We teamed up and we are trying to secure legal, social, and political equality and participation, and also ensure that women and queer people will actually be in positions of power and not white men. So this is also why I am the director of this project. I became the director after a certain time, so that's one box we checked. I am a queer person of color. So maybe it's actually about checking 2.5 boxes with having me as the director. But anyway, what we are looking for, as I said, is the complete legal, social, and political equality for immigrants, people of color, and Black communities in Germany on all levels. We published those materials. You can see they're not exactly new, but they're very, very popular, in fact. And we actually have print reruns every year of about 5,000 pieces because people really are looking out for this pamphlet of ours. It's basically guidelines for intersectional pedagogical practice. So far, this exists only in German, I'm afraid, but we have collected texts, but also interviews about different forms of discrimination and how to work against them with examples from pedagogical practice. So if you want to go for intersectional pedagogy, then I think this is an interesting piece of work we did. And the other one on the right basically just happened as we went along. It was basically the notes we took from workshops. We didn't plan on publishing them, but we just recorded what participants told us in terms of inadequate or unpleasant questions they were getting. So we just started to record all those unpleasant questions people were getting, and then tried to collect and publish them. This exists in German, English, French, and we are now commissioning translations into Arabic and Turkish. But of course, German is our working language, so we can't always ensure translations of our materials into different languages, and we don't just want to, promise that we'll publish in 16 languages when we actually don't have the means to afford these translations. But the languages I mentioned are the languages we are also actually talking in our team, so people can come to us. Oh, there's this English copy as well, as you can see, a guide to treating others respectfully, and you can download it from our website. And now here's a poster that actually has been shown in some schools in Berlin already. This is one of our training modules. We're actually bringing this mannequin into school in order to physically talk about intersectionality. And then on the other hand, we have a list of children's books that could be considered as intersectional. 10 educators and social workers participating in our workshops helped us assemble this list. So, and these are the subjects we're working on. I hope this is not too overwhelming, but we're working on these fields, and these are also issues that basically we have first-hand experience with in our team. So I'm not going to read out all of them, but I think you get an idea. Our iPad team consists of 16 people, and one special feature we have as a project is that we follow the rule that anybody working with us have to be working in an educational or pedagogical field at the same time. So we don't want people who are not in the practice while they're working with us. We want people who actually are able to test anything that we develop and implement in their own practice and bring back feedback from their own practice. So all the 16 people working here have different jobs. I also have, I work in 2 or 3 jobs. So yes, this is sometimes very demanding, but it's also really fun, I have to say. Mostly. Sometimes it's not easy either. Sometimes it's not actually fun, but then we're being very passionate about it. So all the 16 people in our team have been exposed to at least 2 or 3 different forms of discrimination, because we think it's most important that we talk from the first person perspective about discrimination. So in our workshops, we're trying to make sure that the educators, the teamers, bring in experience with the subjects we are talking about, either from a perspective of privilege or position of privilege, or a position of, or a perspective of discrimination. So Macht means power. So a lot of people keep saying, all right, it's really bad. I've been confronted with different forms of discrimination myself. I'm a white German, a teacher, and I went to Istanbul, and I went to a bazaar to do shopping, and then one of the traders actually charged me more money than he should, and that I understood because I know the price of this product I bought, and that was racism against me as a white German in Istanbul. Wouldn't you say that's racism that I experienced? And I said, no, it's quite normal when you go to a market that people will try to rip you off. And I actually would have done the same to you because I know how to bargain. It's not racism because all those layers you can see here actually weren't there. Linguistic, structural, institutional, historical, individual, and mediatic. Then a woman came to my workshop. She was heterosexual, and that was basically a few days after the Christopher Street Day, the Pride March in Berlin. And she said she went there with her husband because she wanted to show solidarity with the LGBTIQ, and she was making out, kissing with her husband there. And then a gay man came up and said, well, you're visible everywhere. Do you really have to kiss in our parade today? And she was so sad and said that was an instance of heterophobia. That was discrimination against heterosexual people. So I told her on the individual level, as you can see on the bottom right, that was not a pleasant experience. I can understand. So you're not happy. But within the context of Germany and in a global context, considering all the other levels here, there is no such thing as heterophobia. There are no slurs. There is no structural discrimination against heterosexuals anywhere in the world. And there aren't any institutions saying, you cannot come here because you're heterosexual. Historically, I don't think anyone ever got themselves arrested for being heterosexual or even killed for being heterosexual. And also in the media, on TV, in books and so on, I think you'll just be represented okay without having to struggle for it. So maybe on an individual level, you might think that this does not do, this is not right. And okay, I can agree, but it's not heterophobia, because that would actually mean that all of these levels would have to be present for it to be a form of discrimination. So I'm giving this example because we are working with very young children and we are able to talk to them about it, of course, in a more childlike, accessible language than I'm talking now, but even for children, it's possible to understand that for discrimination to be at work, all of these levels have to be covered, basically, spotted. So critique of power is basically what most people expect us to do. Diversity is the headline that most people want to invite us under. So I think it's not about saying, oh, I have a very diverse, colorful team or all kinds of people are coming here, but diversity has to deal with three things. Three Ds: diversity, domination, and difference. I think we have to see these as a whole in order to arrive at a critique of power. We also have to talk about relations of domination and subordination and about difference. And we have to tackle these. We have to work against domination in order to achieve diversity. So our target groups and what we offer: process support and organizational development for social and political institutions. That is quite a new thing in Germany, process support. But it's something that we, as the Council of Migration, have been doing for 16 years, I think. And for more than a decade, we've been supporting and accompanying institutions who would like to get more intersectional in their lookout and their whole work. So this is more than just a workshop. Of course, we can't only talk about discrimination if we don't do empowerment of people who have been suffering from discrimination, to give them a space to talk about their experience and to work with organizations from different communities. But also we're classically just training people through workshops and other educational modules, not only children, but structurally. We are working with administrations, with schools, with foundations, and of course we are not working with all the authorities that there are in Berlin. We're not working, for example, with the German army. They approached us, they wanted us to give workshops, so maybe they can render their wars more diverse. I don't know, we actually said no. Apart from that, we're mainly working with professionals and multipliers, and of course with children and youth in all walks of life. So first of all, we're starting with a communication in a certain institution. Also, the people working there. Is this institution barrier-free? How is it actually designed? What posters do I find on the wall? What materials do they have? The textbooks or other materials they're working with? Who are they cooperating with? And what other cooperations, for example, would be possible to enhance the intersectional perspective of this institution? So thanks a lot right now. I'm not sure these were even 15 minutes. I think yes, round about 15 minutes. I think that's fine. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Well, that's basically just a very short perspective. I could really talk to you about this for 7 hours if you ever like me to.
For your inputs. We have about 20 minutes now to discuss and to connect some of your arguments and observations. And again, I would like to invite you, the audience, to send your questions and comments via the chat box. And I just saw that there are already some questions. Joanna, as you are following the discussion in the chat box, could you please read some of the questions aloud so that the panelists can answer them?
Yes, of course. I will start with a question which is directed to all panelists. And a person is asking, a political device to react to discrimination is inclusion. With the application of inclusion, very often any separate structure to organize interests is banned as exclusion. What is the view of the panelists with respect to a respective understanding of inclusion? So it's directed to all of you. Perhaps some person wants to start.
Maybe I can start. I think it's really important to keep in mind that in history, sort of in human rights history, inclusion is sort of an answer to the word integration. For many years in the German context, integration was, for me, a buzzword, but for politicians, sort of the issue. And inclusion is actually a further development of the term, because inclusion says, or at least in theory, inclusion focuses not only on what the others have to do, but also what society has to do in order to include people. And part of this inclusion can obviously be that people need specific structures, which is then not exclusion. I mean, it would make no sense to say that inclusion means it always has to be sort of in a dominant group. So that would be, as far as I understand your question, I would consider inclusion to be sort of a further development of integration, and obviously structures for specific groups can be part of inclusion. That's how I would say.
Okay. Someone wants to add any comment or your perspective? Otherwise, I would continue with the next question to Nivedita, but perhaps someone.
Okay. Ben konuşabilir miyim? Çeviri var sanırım. Can I talk?
Yes.
Hı hı. Aslında ya politik tavırların ayrımcılık ve sosyal içermeyi nasıl etkilediğiyle ilgili Türkiye örneği ilginç bir örnek aslında. Yani Türkiye'de biliyorsunuz
interlocking of institutional and state policies and discrimination on ground. I think Turkey is a very interesting example.
Kayıtlı olarak 4.600.000 civarında geçici koruma kimliğiyle
4.6 million Syrians are registered in Turkey. No, sorry.
3.600.000 civarında.
3.6 million Syrians are registered in Turkey under temporary protection.
Yaklaşık kayıtsız olanlarla birlikte bunun 4 milyon olduğunu
we think that with those who are not registered, these
Şimdi statü o Türkiye hükümetinin bu konudaki statü belirlerken mültecilere 10 yıldır çünkü 10. yılına girecek Nisan ayında.
I mean, in April we have 10 years of war in Syria, right?
Statüsü vermesi
for the last 10 years, these people were afforded temporary protection, which in itself is a form of discrimination because this affects the way they can relate to society and actually structure their lives.
Because 9 yıl boyunca Türkiye'liler yaşayan bu insanlar burada misafirler ve bir gün gidecekler diye
been labeled and treated as guests in Turkey who would leave tomorrow. Everyone was expecting them to leave the next day, so they weren't really expected to establish relations with their neighbors in everyday life. And also because of this temporary status,
sürekli bir taraftan düşünerek onlar da Türkiye toplumuyla
had this thought in mind that they couldn't actually last and they didn't have
9 yıldan sonra şunu görüyoruz ki gittikçe get dolaşan bir toplum var ve bu aslında siyasi kararların bu konuyu nasıl etkilediğinin de en büyük göstergesi bence. Yani belirsiz bir statü, informal bir alan yaratmış durumda.
Uncertainty in informal, mainly informal relations and their social integration is really difficult.
Toplum örgütleri olarak tartışamıyoruz. Son 10 yıldır neredeyse Türkiye'de mültecilik meselesi sivil toplum örgütleri açısından sadece koruma programları içerisinde yardım eksenli yapılıyor.
Those can only approach within the ambit
birlikte yaşam eksenli toplumsal uyumu savunan
temporary protection laws.
Olarak çok az iş düşüyor çünkü herkes bütün fonlar
yapılan her şey sadece
yardım eksenli
all the funds that we actually can get are meant to be spent on humanitarian aid.
Bunu mesela pandemi döneminde şunu gördük. Pandemi döneminde gerçekten Suriyeli mültecilerin, bu ülkedeki yaşayan Suriyeli mültecilerin aylarca yalnız kaldıklarını gördük. Yani ne kamu kurumları bunlara bir hizmet verdiler çünkü vatandaş olmadıkları için belediyeler hizmet götürmediler. Diğer tarafta sivil toplum örgütleri de bütün hizmetlerini durdurup home office çalıştıkları için saha boşaldı ve insanlar gerçekten çaresiz kaldılar.
The NGOs come and of course they didn't.
Thank you, Kemal. I would like to continue with 2 questions to Nivedita. And the person is thanking a lot for your interesting presentation. And she likes a lot that you utilize intersectionality in examination of discrimination against men and boys. But what would you say to some feminist scholars who argue that Crenshaw's intersectionality should not be used out of its original context, woman of color? Yes.
That's very interesting because I myself come from the feminist movement and from the feminist of color movement in Germany. And I understand the concept, and also how, for example, how Crenshaw has commented on Black Lives Matters. She has made it very clear that the vulnerability of young boys of color or Black boys is much higher than that of women. And she would actually argue the problem is only because the vulnerability is higher does not mean that women are not affected by racial profiling. So she would basically argue, and I would agree to that, that applying intersectionality to all bodies makes sense, but not if it contributes to making women of color invisible. So one of her critiques on the Black Lives Matters movement is exactly that we know per percentage, it's more boys and men that are being killed, which does not mean that girls and women are not being killed. So intersectionality, if it's used to sort of make invisible the vulnerabilities of women, would be problematic. But I hope that is not what I did, because what I try to focus on is that sort of connecting masculinity to refugee boys has a total different notion than connecting masculinity to white middle-class boys. And I think that is what I would like to sort of to focus on from a feminist perspective, because I would even argue that feminists, white feminists, actually have contributed. I can only talk for Germany. We have a very femo-nationalist feminists who actually are contributing to this very racist stereotypes of refugee boys and men to be dangerous. I mean, we're talking about boys, children, right? So I would argue from a feminist perspective, it's very important to concentrate on these sort of multiple layers of oppression that makes children seem to be dangerous for the white body, to put it in a very sort of post-colonial term.
Thank you. The next question is also relating to your comment now. So the person is asking or saying, sorry, I have never thought about the application of intersectionality beyond the woman context again. I wonder if you have ever received a critique, especially from the scholars of feminist studies, for applying the intersectionality concept to male bodies. Also, I'd like to ask if there is a way that we can access the exhibition that you have referred online, considering the current circumstances. So yeah,
I'd start with the easier part. I can put the link into the chat. The exhibition is available online, and if you speak German or Arabic, you can also understand the comments. If you don't speak German or Arabic, you can only see the pictures. I just added into the chat, and the boys would be delighted to have their exhibition seen internationally, because they are very proud of the exhibition, and I think they have all reason to be proud of it. And to the other question, again, it's funny for me to talk about getting critiques from feminist scholars, because I consider myself to be a feminist scholar of color. So for me, there is not a contradiction on it. And I would even argue that we don't even have intersectional belonging and discriminations, but we also have intersectional privileges. I mean, and how do we talk about discrimination not looking into privilege? So I would even argue that intersectionality was not created to make, I mean, not even not created, sort of the background of sort of creating the term was to looking into discrimination, but I find intersectionality a very interesting lens to also make privileges visible. If you're a white, heterosexual, able-bodied man or boy in Germany, you have intersectional privilege, not only male privilege plus class privilege plus body and so on, but it is the intersectional privilege of being white male and so on. So I actually also use intersectionality as a term to make intersectional privileges visible.
Okay, great. And the next question goes to Kemal. The person's saying, I recently did my MA thesis on the exclusional processes affecting DOM and Abdal children in Turkey. I would be really interested to know what kind of on-the-ground strategies you would suggest are working to increase educational inclusion for DOM and Abdal children, especially during the pandemic. You can also read, Kemal, the question, because it's a long one. In the chat box, if you open it, I can repeat it, or?
Yeah, I read. Pandemi döneminde aslında yani doğum çocuklar için acil olarak ne önerilebilir eğitimleriyle ilgili bu böyle bir soru var. Şimdi daha önce de söylediğim gibi aslında Türkiye'li doğum çocuk ve abdal çocukların eğitime erişimi ile ilgili sorun sürekli var ama mülteci doğum ve abdal çocukları kadar değil. Yani %95 oranında mülteci doğum ve abdal çocukları okula gitmiyor. Bunun öncelikle bunun temel sebepleri yani pandemi öncesindeki temel sebepleri okullarda ayrımcılığın uygulanması, ailelerin ekonomik durumlarının çok kötü olması, yani çocuğu şöyle bir şey var, bu Türkiye'li ve Suriyeli doğum aileleri, abdal aileleri için geçerli. Eğitim onlar için aile ekonomisine ekstra bir yük olarak algılanıyor. Ve aileye gelen parayı da azaltan bir şey olarak algılanıyor. Çünkü çocuğun emeğine, yaşanmak için çocuğun emeğine de ihtiyaç duyuyor bu aileler. Yani o açıdan aileler işte mevsimlik tarım işçiliği yapan aile çocuğuyla birlikte gidiyor. Atık toplayan aile çocuğuyla birlikte gidiyor ve bu çocuk emeği aileye geçim olarak yansıyor. Pandemi döneminde bu daha da arttı. Çünkü sokağa çıkma belli dönemlerde yasaklar ailelerin geçimlerini oldukça zorlaştırdı ve aileler mevsimlik tarım işçiliği için çok fazla yer değiştirir hale geldiler. İkincisi, şimdi bizim ailelerimiz, diğer yandan bizim ailelerimiz büyük ölçüde kalabalık aileler ve bu ailelerin yaşadıkları evlerde çoğu zaman tek odalı evlerde ya da 2 odalı evlerde yaşıyorlar ve pandemi döneminde bu uzaktan eğitim sistemi yani alabilecek koşullar bu ailelerde yok. Çoğunda internet yok zaten. İnterneti olan ailelerin düşünün bir odada yaşıyorsunuz. Kışın sadece soba bir odada yanıyor ve evin bütün bireyleri yararlanmasını bekliyoruz. Bu da diğer teknik sorunlardan birisi. Bu açıdan bence Türkiye'de şunun yapılması lazım. Yani diğer ülkelerde bu uygulamaya gidildi. Temel vatandaşlık geliri bizim ailelerimiz için uygulaması gerekiyor. Yani hiç olmasa bu çocukların eğitimini sağlayacak bir sabit gelirin olması gerekiyor ve bu pandemi döneminde çok gerekli bir şey. Yoksa zaten biz yani insanlar evlerinde yemek bulamıyorlar ve biz gidip çocuklarınızı okula gönderin dediğimizde bir anlam ifade etmiyor. İkincisi şöyle bir şey yapılabilir. Mahallelerdeki toplum merkezleri, mahalle evleri bu çocuklar için uzaktan eğitimden yararlanacakları hale getirilebilir. Ve buralarda günün belli saatleri o çocukların uzaktan eğitim almaları sağlanabilir. Türkiye'de bu mahalle evi kavramını biraz belki bunun için dönüştürebiliriz. Ve özellikle mülteci çocuklar açısından ise işte ASAM gibi sivil toplum örgütlerinin hala toplum merkezleri var az da olsa. O toplum merkezlerinde bu çocukların eğitimi desteklenebilir.
Mainly run by NGOs and some of them are very good, so they can actually
Şimdilik bunlar da aslında daha pek çok şey var ekleyebileceğimiz ama özellikle bu temel vatandaşlık geliri yani ailenin sabit geliri
that income, that basic income, now it's a technical problem, is indispensable, very important.
Thank you, Kim. As participatory action research has an important goal of empowering the participants, I would be very interested in the impact of the research of this empowerment of the refugee minors. So she's asking about the impact of the participatory action research, on the empowerment of refugee minors. Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you, Anna. You cannot.
Okay, you cannot hear me, Nivedita, so perhaps you can read.
Or in the...
Nivedita, could you please select the interpretation section and click to
should
the
I answer to the question on participatory action research?
Yes.
I'm sorry, John, I couldn't hear what you said, which is a pity, but I can read the question, yes. Yes, I mean, participatory action research projects are very challenging, to put it in a neutral term, because they need a lot of time, but also flexibility. So for example, in this case, when Annabelle Specht started the core, the project, she asked the boys, would you like to sort of, show your realities? And the first thing they said is, yes, but not here in Berlin. We want to go on holiday because we're never allowed to go on holiday. So the first thing she had to do is sort of to apply for money and for the legal possibility for the boys to leave Berlin. So that was sort of the first important thing for the boys, that they actually had the possibility to physically leave the city to go on holiday. So that was the first thing. And for the boys, it was really important. What they always said is to be seen as young boys and not to be seen as refugees. So they sort of had these pictures, and when the exhibition started, we had a proper vernissage, which was really interesting because the boys invited their teachers, their neighbors, their legal guardians, girls they were interested in, other students from class, because they really had the impression that for the first time they were seen with what they can do, and to seen with all the diverse backgrounds they have. And obviously for today, I just chose sort of those pictures that sort of, sort of fitted what I was wanting to say, but you have very funny pictures, you have very neutral pictures. So for them, it was really important. And Alaa, who is a carpenter, he actually built a bar for the vernissage and was very proud of his bar because he built it from upcycled material. So he could show what he can do. And I remember talking to his teacher, who was very surprised, in quotation marks, that these boys can do so much more. And I was like, just because they don't speak German does not mean they have other limited resources. So I would say for the boys, it was really important to have the possibility of showing who they are according to themselves. And obviously young boys will not, or very seldom will they show uncool parts of their life, but that's what boys and girls at this age are about, to sort of have a self-representation that has nothing to do with the stamp of being a refugee, but of being young children.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. We have to come to an end now, but first of all, I'd like to ask you, Tuba and Aisha, would you like to add anything what has been discussed before? Tuba, please.
Deutsch wieder. Kurz Oliver Zeit lassen, um sich darauf einzustellen. Okay. Ich wollte noch zu dem Inklusionsthema was sagen. Ich glaube...
Something on the topic of inclusion. I think that's a problematic concept as well. We're always asking ourselves, who needs to be included and who is supposed to be this circle?
Und in Inklusion
that you would see in diagrams that everybody should be a part of. Who determines the frame? I think within the pedagogical practice we're working in, I think this frame needs to be dismantled. Who says that who needs to be included? No, I think with every person, we have to negotiate how society is structured. And this doesn't work if we just think about inclusion, or even worse, integration of some people into something. Because who sets the frame? It's patriarchy, it's capitalism, it's colonialism or imperialism that actually determine the frame. So I don't want to talk about inclusion. I want to talk about spaces that we can negotiate and define together. We can see how the laws that structure these spaces can be structured, can be changed. And everybody needs to get a voice. That's what pedagogy is for.
There is a state obligation to provide inclusion, and if you sort of apply inclusion to other aspects, like aspects of access to education, it is state responsibility. So I do understand the discomfort, the term inclusion, but I would say it is much better than integration, because the responsibility of the state is very visible, and actually the focus is on the responsibility of the state.
Aisha?
Yeah, maybe I can add also something at this point, because also from my understanding of inclusion means that actually focusing on the different identities and categorizes and also experiences of people, rather than creating hierarchy between people. So I don't understand actually with the inclusion means that some people are in the position and then can include others. Because inclusions actually provide broaden and broaden perspective of human rights as well. For example, LGBT movements have been exist and visible in Turkey, but also there is need to more solidarity with refugees in the movement, and this solidarity should move to international collaboration to support LGBT plus refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and minors beyond borders. And this can be also through inclusive intersectional perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. We obviously haven't reached the end of the discussion yet, but we have unfortunately reached the end of our time. So thank you, the audience, for participating in the discussion. We would now like to ask you, Anna, to do the very challenging work of summing up and discussing the various contributions of this panel from your point of view. So before you do this, I would like to introduce you briefly. Anna Karastatis is a political theorist with a PhD from McGill University in Montreal in 2016. She published a book under the title Intersectionality, Origins, Contestations, Horizons. And Anna is co-director of the Feminist Autonomous Center for Research in Athens and a postdoctoral fellow in the project Transcity, Gender, Space and Transitions in Athens, that is based at the Department of Social Anthropology at Pantheon University. And Anna is also involved as a researcher in a strategic partnership funded by Erasmus Plus called Bridges, Building Inclusive Societies, Diversifying Knowledge and Tackling Discrimination through Civil Society Participation in University. Anna, we are very much looking forward to listen to your thoughts now.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you, Ellen and Joanna, for inviting FAC Research to be a collaborating to be a collaborating partner in this digital conference, and also to the Istanbul Policy Center. I have been listening with great interest and speaking to you now from Athens in lockdown number 2 for citizens and residents in cities and towns, and a perpetual lockdown since mid-March for people forced to live in camps. So just, I don't know if I can do what I've been asked to do, which is to summarize the presentations that we heard from Nivedita, Kemal, Aisha, and Tuba, as they were all so rich and complex and raised so many issues we've already discussed a little bit. The difficulty of even using terms or understanding terms across contexts or across purposes with this notion of inclusion and integration. But I suppose that discussion that we just had gives me a small opening to say something that I was kind of thinking about as I was listening to the discussions yesterday and today, which is that when we're considering the questions of access and indeed the inaccessibility of education due to structural interpersonal racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, disability, and legal status. And, you know, of course, it's important while advocating for this accessible, free, universal education at all levels to question what are we seeking access to, what kind of education. And I wonder whether, given that the notion of education is perhaps like inevitably bound up with the coloniality of power, with misogyny, with elitism, the reproduction of the class system, whether we might want to talk about knowledges instead, and whether we might want to challenge and contest the kinds of structures that we have validated in society as, you know, the holders of knowledge, and what groups are fundamentally excluded from those structures. Of course, about the exclusion of children who don't have legal status or whose legal status is precarious in national societies, or who are from peripatetic communities, or who face endemic, now pandemic, racism in societies structured by white supremacy or by cultural ethnocentrism, and so on. Girls, LGBTIQ young people who are, I think, Aisha, you mentioned this in your presentation, who are not even considered a viable identity often, such that, you know, a kind of presumptive heteronormativity is projected particularly onto children in heteropatriarchal societies, and certainly a pervasive cisgender oppression, where the binary gender system is probably inculcated as the major ideology in school systems, certainly in the three societies, national societies we talked about, Germany, Greece, and Turkey. Yesterday, there was mention made, and I kind of wanted to, as I was thinking about the talks today, I kind of wanted us to come back to mention made to the multiple crises or interlocking crises, as I believe Liz Fekete put it, that we're facing at the moment. A crisis of capitalism, perhaps the worst crisis of capitalism that we've seen in the history of that system. A climate crisis, a so-called refugee crisis declared by European leaders, with the UNHCR following suit in that declaration. A border crisis declared by Greek and Turkish authorities, governments, and a pandemic crisis, which of course is central to our discussion right now. And I guess as we look at these multiple crises, one question that I think kind of emerges from our discussion this morning is, what can intersectionality bring as a lens to our conceptualization of crises and to the resistance that we may take to crises? And I think one thing that intersectionality can do, and Nivedita, you, I think, mentioned this in your very succinct and helpful explanation of the concept in the very beginning of our discussion, that intersectionality as an integrative model is a distinct approach to additive models that sort of try to combine, add up different categories or forms or axes of oppression. And it's really a model that insists on the simultaneity of factors of oppression, belonging, discrimination. We've used different terms to kind of think about what's intersecting. So simultaneity is a huge sort of methodological merit, I guess, of intersectionality. But I think another thing that intersectionality can help us do is actually to question the categories that we're using. And I think here, something that is very important in the way that Ellen and Joanna, you introduced kind of the topic of the conference, is to get us thinking beyond this kind of objectifying and homogenizing one-dimensionality of the construct or the category of so-called refugee children. And already our speakers, I think this morning, have complicated and shown the different kinds of exclusions internal to the constitution of that category that intersectionality can help us start to reveal. And I think in terms of questioning the categories, we can start to question what work crises discourses, what work is this declaration of one crisis after another crisis after another crisis is doing in societies, in global society. For instance, perhaps we might say that it's separating out populations for distinct forms of governance, necropolitical governance, biopolitical governance. You know, I made a mention earlier about a second lockdown interrupted by a fairly, quote unquote, normal summer for citizens and residents living in Greece, while there's a perpetual lockdown since mid-March for the pretext of this so-called refugee crisis being used actually to separate out in the context of a pandemic two populations, at least two populations, for very differential treatment, where one is seen as a population to protect from transmission, and another, I think could be argued quite easily, is seen as a population to subject to transmission of the coronavirus. The other thing I think we could do by intersecting crises is to get a sense of how these distinct crises discourses pit social groups against each other, hindering a kind of coalitional imagination. So I think we saw this in very stark terms in terms of the declaration of the financial crisis earlier in this century. And certainly we see it in terms of the declaration of a refugee crisis. We saw it in one of the speakers' presentations yesterday, Ayhan, who talked about the way in which a kind of nostalgia, a kind of feeling of persecution and a kind of scapegoating, a nostalgic deprivation, I believe was the concept he used, is fomented amongst working class, disenfranchised citizens in European states against refugees, asylum seekers, and anyone marked other in racial, ethno-national, linguistic, religious terms. And finally, I think it helps us kind of see, intersecting crises helps us see how sedimented and naturalized categories become when they're inscribed on people's bodies, on our bodies. And I think, you know, it's useful to say, to ask, Mari Matsuda, a theorist of intersectionality, has this methodological trick which is asking the other question about a particular category. So what might it mean to ask the other question about crises? Where is race, as many people have been saying? Where is racism in the pandemic? Of course, it is everywhere. It is in racist policing. It is in racist segregation of populations. It is in the completely uneven effects of the pandemic on people of color, Black people, Roma people, and people denied legal status, given precarious legal status in European societies. Where is the economy in the refugee crisis, and so on? Whom do we put at the center of analysis and resistance when we are identifying, be they crises or systems of oppression that have a long continuity? It really resonated with me, the discussions about empowerment and the suggestions about empowerment that each of our speakers emphasized. I think access is important to insist upon, but the issue really is, I believe Issa put it this way, that it's really an issue of empowerment and not only inclusion and access. And again, with this last discussion, I think Tuba, you mentioned that the problem with inclusion is it leaves unanswered the question, who determines the frame? I think this is a very powerful formulation. Anyway, I think I've run out of time a little bit, yes. But there's so much more to say, and perhaps, you know, we can continue this conversation, certainly in the other panels this afternoon, but also, you know, amongst us on another occasion. So thank you for bringing us together, Ellen and Joanna.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this great and thought-provoking conclusion and last contribution on this panel. I also hope we will find ways to keep in touch and to continue this exchange, this discussion, maybe in the next meeting or in a written form, we will see. And if you, the audience, would like to get in touch with the speakers again, you can do so via our email address, inclusiveeducation@Sabancı University, edu. You'll find this address also on our website, inclusiveeducationacrossborders.com, where you also have the possibility to subscribe to our newsletter, and we will display also the address and the link, I think, on a slide in a moment. Again, thank you very much to all of you for participating. We now have a 2-hour conference break, almost 2 hours, and we would like to, we would be delighted to see you all again in the next panel, which is on inclusive education, ways and means of countering discrimination in education with the help of civil society organizations, where we will continue probably the discussion about the sense and nonsense of the term and idea of inclusion. So thank you, and hopefully see you again soon. Bye-bye.